You want to learn how to draw underwater scenes like I do? Hi, my name is Oyun Orka, a VTuber who tries to draw, and underwater scenes are one of my favorite backgrounds to illustrate. It's relatively easy and can look super beautiful without too much effort. So for today, let's talk about ways that you can draw underwater scenes. Firstly, why is the ocean blue? So this might seem like a silly question to start out a drawing video with, but it's good to first understand how colors work underwater before diving straight into the drawing. So according to the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration's 2023 Ocean Facts page, the ocean is blue because water absorbs colors in the red part of the light spectrum. Like a filter, this leaves behind colors in the blue part of the light spectrum for us to see. So this means that the closer we are to the water surface, the more colors will be visible. But the deeper that you go into the ocean, the more of the red wavelength gets absorbed. Under regular conditions underwater, the color red starts to disappear at around 5 meters, orange at 10 meters, yellow at 20, green at 30, and blue at 60. Colors may be somewhat still visible beyond these depths, but generally, the deeper that you go underwater, the more cooler or bluer in hue something will appear because the other colors are filtered out. This means that if you want to go for a more realistic look in your drawing, you can use less color filters when the character is closer to the water surface, and use more blue or cool tone filters the deeper that you go underwater, since blue is the last color to disappear. But to finish the quote from earlier, most of the ocean is actually completely dark. Hardly any light penetrates deeper than 656 feet, and no light penetrates deeper than 3,280 feet. Assuming that you don't want to draw an underwater scene at 3,280 feet or deeper, I'll be focusing more on drawing characters relatively closer to the water's surface. So while the ocean does generally appear bluish because of color absorption underwater, as discussed earlier, since ocean water is translucent, the closer you are to the surface, the more some of the sky or atmosphere above the water will sort of blend into it. So water under a sunset sky may take on a more greenish tone due to the orange-reddish sky kind of blending in with the perceived blue color of the ocean. An ocean at dusk may have some light teal tones from the sky, and an ocean under a night sky may have some darker blue tones. And if you're drawing above the water surface, some of the sky's colors will be reflected back at the viewer too, not just underwater. Also, depending on the angle and how deep the perspective of the viewer is, you might be able to see parts of the sky from the water ripples as light travels through the surface of the water. I'll show how I draw something similar to both of these examples shortly. Now, that concludes our short lecture, so let's dive straight into the drawing demonstration. Since the focus of this video isn't on how to draw characters, I'll go ahead and speed up this part. But also, if you want me to post speed paints that aren't sped up so quickly, let me know. I don't usually post speed paints, but maybe I'll start recording them in the future if people are interested. And if you want to watch me draw in real time, catch me on twitch.tv/Oyun Orka. I stream every once in a while, and you're also welcome to stop by and ask questions if you'd like. So for the first underwater scene that we'll try to do, let's do one that's very close to the water surface. So say that this black line represents the water surface, and then this character represents how close or far they are from the surface. So let's start by drawing an underwater scene where the character is closer to the water surface, and the character's colors are more like the original colors. So I'll start by color picking some colors from the photo reference from the example presentation earlier, and you can kind of think about where the light is coming from. So because let's say the surface is around over here, and then the sky and atmosphere is going to have some light coming from over here, so from the top right hand corner. So going back to our diagram from earlier, imagine that the camera is around over here, and right now we're kind of viewing the character from this angle. So the waves are going to be kind of on this plane, where it's disappearing onto the horizon over here, and maybe there will be larger waves closer to where the viewer is. To represent that, we can kind of follow this reference here from the photo and make like a darker color in this right hand corner. Since this is on a separate layer, I'll go ahead and use a more painterly brush to erase some parts from it. And so while I'm erasing these parts to kind of form the wave shape, I'm making sure that the wave shapes in this section, so closer to where the viewer is a little bit larger, and the waves in this section, where it's a little bit further up off in the distance, is smaller. How I generally like to draw bubbles is to first use a white brush, and then just slightly make some small circles. And then depending on the size of the bubble, sometimes I'll just leave them as white bubbles, but if I want slightly larger bubbles, I'll go ahead and make a slightly larger circle and then use an airbrush to sort of erase from the center. Then I'll actually take a darker brush and go and make some contrasting darker shapes, and then add some highlights. Now obviously doing these bubbles one by one manually if I want to draw a lot of bubbles will take a lot of time. So instead of doing this manually, I've actually made a brush which I've uploaded onto the Clip Studio Paint Assets store. You can download this brush on the Clip Studio Paint Assets store, and I've also linked it down in the description below. So here, when using this brush, you want to make sure that the primary color is a darker color and then the secondary color here is a lighter color. So now I'll go ahead and add some bubbles using this brush. So by default, I have this brush kind of where the bubbles have light coming from the top here. But as you can see, the light source from this drawing is from the top right hand corner instead of straight up and down. So to fix that, all you have to do is rotate the canvas, and when you use this brush, the bubbles should rotate as well. Now that we've finished blending the colors for the background, I'll go ahead and shade the character. Because we know that the lighting is coming from the top right hand side, I'll go ahead and plan the colors accordingly. I'll make a new layer and then clip that to the character to kind of plan the shading. So now that we finished the base shading, because the skin color is naturally more warm toned, I'll go ahead and select that, and then select all the layers above that, and make sure that I click delete selection. That way it's only selecting the skin color. And going back to my shading layer, I'll go ahead and lock transparency of the shading layer and then select a slightly warmer color. Also on the shading layer, while the transparency is still locked, I'll use a lighter blue and just kind of use an airbrush to bring in some of the colors, some of the areas where light is hitting. Another thing I like to add when drawing underwater scenes is some sort of water light refraction. So you can kind of draw this manually or using a brush. I'll first demonstrate how to do it manually. So using any sort of brush, you can use like a regular pen or some sort of crayon brush, and then clip that to the character layer above the shading layer and make sure it's on a separate layer. So now I'll go ahead and make these like random squiggly circles, and they don't have to look perfect since we'll be blurring this later anyways, and just make round circular shapes. So now that we finished drawing our squiggles, I'll go ahead and use filter, blur, and then Gaussian blur to blur it until I think it looks more like the water refractions. Next, I'll lower the opacity, set this to either add glow or another sort of lighten layer, and then make sure to go selection from layer, create selection on the shading layer, and then clear that or delete that from the refraction layer. This is because this light is coming from the surface of the water, and then on areas that are the shadows where light would not hit, the same texture would not be on there as well. Unless, however, this was bouncing from some sort of surface beneath the character. So say there was some sort of sand beneath this, then some of this might bounce back onto the character. Another way to do this that might save some time is to instead use a brush. I like using this water description brush here on Clip Studio Paint, which is also linked in the description down below. So to use this brush, I'll go ahead and make another layer, make sure that it's also clipped above the character, and then just use this brush, and it does that all manually for me and creates this nice water texture. I'll go ahead and adjust the perspective of this, and then I'll also use the liquify tool to sort of make sure that it fits the shape of the character. Next, I'll just set this to screen. Once again, go to selection from layer, create selection from the shading layer, and then clear that from this layer. What I like about this brush is it also creates some highlights onto the character on the areas where it's being lit up. I'll also go ahead and add a little bit of the hair highlight just to make it pop a little bit more. And finally for the character, I'll go ahead and add a little bit of bounce light onto the character, making a new layer that's clipped to the character, just adding a little bit of bounce light. Before this bounce light layer, I kind of color pick from the sea area above, so this is about the same color as the sea area next to the character, and I set this to screen, lower the opacity, and that gives a nice bounce light effect. So I feel like the bubbles are maybe too much, and maybe let's try redrawing the bubbles. I'll also go ahead and add a little bit of detail onto the background area, with some little bit of seaweed. Using my brush from earlier, I'll go ahead and increase the particle size and adjust the angle. Now I'll blur this layer and pretend that this is closer to the viewer. Next, I'll lower the particle size of this and make really small bubbles. And for the final touches, I'll go ahead and use a light airbrush Go ahead and airbrush around the character where I want the focus to be, and also use a new overlay layer to make some adjustments to the color. And then to imagine the sunlight kind of hitting on the character from the surface above, I'll go ahead and use a warm airbrush. Also airbrush some light on top of the character, as well as some streaks from the side as well to represent sunlight kind of shining through water surface. And with that, we finished our first demonstration for underwater scenes. You can see that because the character is close to the surface, more of the sunlight shines onto the character and therefore preserves more of the original colors. Also, using various close to paintbrushes, we can quickly create an underwater scene without too much effort. But what if you wanted to draw your character a little bit deeper underwater, or at a different angle? Well, let's try that as well. When you want to draw your character at a sort of medium depth, you could draw the character just from the straight on angle, where you don't really see the surface above or the stuff below, and it's just the character in some water and bubbles. But you could also try doing it from a lower angle, where you can kind of see the surface and the sunlight from above. So to get an effect similar to this photo over here, the method I like to use is to first use one color for the main sea, and then create a sort of shape where you want the light to be coming from, and make sure it's on a separate layer. And so this is where you can kind of see the sky and the surface. Next, I'll use a painterly brush, sort of block in some wave shapes. I'll also set this brush to erase to go ahead and take away from some of this shape. Now that I finished this shape, I'll go ahead and lock transparent pixel, and then color this in like it's the sky. So pretend that you don't really see the ocean, and then you're just kind of drawing in a sky. So if you're underwater at a certain angle, you might be able to still see the sun, kind of like these photos. And just use a white airbrush, block in the sun. Also create some streaks as well to create like the effect of like a shining bright sun. Now that that's done, let's go back to our base layer for the ocean and just kind of create a gradient. So essentially by separating this surface water layer from the base layer, you can kind of create this nice effect of the sky shining through the water. I'll go ahead and add some more details to the shape, just to polish it up a little bit more. Finally, similar to the photos here, let's add some streaks of light kind of coming from the surface. Now since the lighting is coming from kind of the back of the character, I'll go ahead and block in the shading accordingly. So since the character is a little bit further down below, let's say that the character is actually in shallow water, where there's some light kind of bouncing from the surface and then back onto the character. So to draw that, I'll go ahead and block in some shapes, kind of coming from the bottom left-hand corner and shining onto the character, and then just erasing from this shape where I think the shadows should go. So like last time, I'll use the water surface brush, create a new layer, draw in some of the water surface, and then this time use selection from layer of the lighting that I did and leading the area outside of that. I'll also add a little bit of a airbrush on the bottom to kind of give the effect of bounce light. And then I'll go ahead and finish off with my bubbles brush, where I'll go ahead and blur larger bubbles that are closer to the viewer and then draw smaller bubbles further away from the viewer, and then add some overlay layers to finish it up. So now we finished our second demonstration of underwater scenes. Since the character is a bit deeper underwater, we can use blue overlays to represent underwater color absorption, and also create some bounce light for the water caustics. So let's say that you want to draw your character even deeper underwater, like way deeper underwater. Well, technically you could be realistic and just draw a black screen, but obviously you didn't click on this tutorial to learn how to use a black fill bucket. So when drawing these sorts of really dark scenes, it's okay to be a little bit unrealistic and maybe have imaginary sources of lighting. Oftentimes when you see underwater photography at a very deep depth, there will actually be some sort of artificial light that photographers will use to capture the photo. So you can kind of take these lighting principles into mind and draw a sort of magical, unrealistic underwater scene. At this depth, you can use bubble brushes, or you can even use star brushes or any sort of speckle brushes to kind of give the effect of marine snow. We'll also go ahead and add some jellyfish based on the photo reference, just to add a little bit of visual interest and draw the viewer's eyes from left to right. This time, since the scene doesn't really follow conventional underwater lighting rules, I'll go ahead and be more experimental with the lighting here. So now that I've generally finished with the lighting, I'll go ahead and add an airbrush layer behind the character once again, just to sort of highlight the character itself. and then finish it off with some extra effect layers like overlay layers and RGB shift. And with that, we finish our last demonstration for underwater drawing. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would appreciate if you could give this video a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more from my channel. Also, if you'd like to learn more on how to draw backgrounds, particularly with photos, check out my other video linked on screen here. If you have questions or would like me to cover a specific video topic next, feel free to let me know in a comment down below. I'll see you next time. Bye bye!